He caught the cat without even looking. He pulled the plug out of the toaster at exactly 9 seconds. He caught the cork before it flew out. 4,000 years in a single day taught him everything. And then the day ended and his hands trembled, not with joy, with horror. Dan Hale stands by the window and for the first time in millennia doesn't know what will happen in the next second. There was no reset last night. A new morning has dawned. A different sun is shining through the window. He grabs the edge of the table and stands there for a full minute. He's forgotten what it's like, not knowing what will happen at 7:15, not knowing who will walk down the street, not knowing what the shopkeeper at the corner store will say. For 4,000 years, he lived in a single day. Every sound was memorized, every face was familiar, every step was calculated, and now it's all over. The world has become vast and unfamiliar. Dan exhales. He smiles. Quietly, like a man who has finally woken up after a very long sleep. He puts on his jacket and goes out. On the stairwell stands a girl he hasn't seen once in all his time here. Blonde hair, a bag slung over her shoulder. She greets him with a "good morning" in a tone as if she says it every day. Dan opens his mouth, closes it. He knows 22 languages of Arcadia, the dead dialects of the founding houses, and now he can't squeeze out 2 words to a stranger. She's already heading down the stairs. In the loop, he stopped speaking about 500 years ago. Why bother if no one will remember it by morning? He steps out onto the street. Arcadia greets him with noise. The gifted in their academy cloaks, the flat ones in their jumpsuits, delivery people on electric bikes. Dan walks and soaks in every detail. The traffic light changes every 42 seconds. The saleswoman sneezes in 3 seconds. She sneezes. The old world is still holding on. But around the corner, the unknown begins. He reaches the 7 Towers Academy district, the territory of the gifted. The flat ones are allowed in here as cleaners and couriers. It's not recommended to wander in without a purpose. Dan goes in. He heads to the coffee shop, the most expensive one in the area, the kind where the flat ones are turned away at the door. A girl stands behind the counter, straight back, perfect hairstyle. An apron with the Songhouse crest. Jiwoo Song, 19 years old, heiress to one of the founding houses. She glances at his cheap jacket and worn-out sneakers. Her expression doesn't change. She asks what he'd like. Her politeness is thinner than paper. Dan looks at her for 2 seconds. He sees a micro-tension at the corners of her lips, a shadow under her left eye, the habit of clenching her fingers around the pitcher's handle when she's nervous. He knows everything about her. She told him herself during one of their drunken ramblings. At 3 a.m, in the back room of this very coffee shop. She cried and talked about her father, who raised her as a showcase for the house rather than as a daughter. About the drink she invented at 16 after their fight. Cinnamon, orange zest, a drop of miso. She never made it again. Embarrassing. Not by the book. Dan asks her to make this drink calmly, without a challenge. He describes the recipe. Cinnamon, orange zest, a drop of miso. He says he'll pay for 2. The pitcher slips from her hand and clangs against the counter. Silence hangs in the coffee shop. The 2 gifted ones at the table look up. Jai. Yu looks at him as if he'd hit her. It doesn't hurt, but it hits home, right in the most vulnerable spot. Dan adds, more quietly. He says he's sorry, that he just thought she needed this drink more than he did today. He puts the money on the counter, turns around, walks out, doesn't look back. Out on the street, he exhales and realizes his hands are shaking. Not from fear. For the first time in thousands of years, his words have consequences. In the loop, he could say anything. In the morning, everything was reset. But now, This girl will remember. She'll think about his words tonight. Maybe tonight. That's scarier than any fight. Dan walks 3 blocks and turns onto a street with no name. A narrow passage between 2 old buildings. A staircase down. A basement with cloudy windows at street level. The "For Rent" sign has been hanging here for as long as he can remember. He's called this number 1,000 times in the loops. He knows the landlord by name. He knows the man will lower the price if he mentions the granddaughter who loves caramel lattes. Dan calls. He seals the deal in 20 minutes. He hands over his last bit of cash. He goes downstairs and stands in the middle of the empty room. A dusty floor, bare walls, an old counter, 2 windows through which he can see the leagues of passers-by. He runs his finger along the counter. Here goes the coffee machine. Here goes a shelf for cups. Here are 3 tables. That's all he needs. He isn't building a business. He's building a place where he can brew coffee for a specific person who will sit across from him, not for a customer, for a person. Over 4,000 years he has perfected one thing, not swords, not magic, coffee, perfect for a specific person, taking into account their mood and lack of sleep and personal history and what they really want, but are afraid to ask for. This is what kept him sane all those millennia, brewing coffee over and over again for people who will forget him tomorrow, but now they won't forget. And that thought warms him so much it stings his eyes. He sits on the floor with his back to the counter. He stares at the dusty ceiling, and for the first time in 4,000 years, he thinks that tomorrow he wants to wake up, not out of habit, for real. By evening, half the neighborhood is whispering about the flat-faced man who walked into the Songhouse coffee shop and said something to the heiress that made her drop the pitcher. Some say he's gifted, hiding his gift. Others say he's a spy from a foreign house. Still others say he's just crazy. Ji-woo Song closes the coffee shop an hour early. She sends her assistants home. She stays alone. She takes out cinnamon, an orange, a jar of miso. She stands behind the counter. Her hands are shaking. She hasn't made this in 3 years, not since that evening when she first came up with it at 16 after a fight with her father, when she cried and threw whatever she could get her hands on into the cup. It turned out ridiculous. It turned out perfect. She takes a sip and cries, not because of the taste, because someone remembered it. Someone she doesn't know. A flat-faced guy in a cheap jacket. How did he know? That question would torment her for several weeks. But for now, she drinks her coffee in the empty cafe, and for the first time in a long time, she doesn't feel like a display window. The morning of the second day began with Dan being unable to get out of bed. Not physically. He just lay there and listened to the sounds, new sounds. Yesterday, someone was laughing behind the wall at 11 o'clock at night. That hadn't been in any of the loops. The upstairs neighbor dropped something heavy at midnight. That was a first, too. The world was alive, changing, making different noises. Dan lay there, soaking it all in like a sponge. Then he got up. The cat was waiting on the windowsill. He petted her. He stepped out into the hallway. The neighbor from downstairs. That one. Blonde hair, headphones. She was climbing the stairs with a grocery bag. She saw Dan and said he'd forgotten to say hello yesterday. Her tone was mocking, but without malice. Dan said good morning. She snorted and replied that it was almost noon by now. She introduced herself. Hale Mason, a student. She lives 1 floor down. Moved in 3 months ago. Dan nodded. 3 months ago. She wasn't here in the loop, so she must have appeared after that. In the new timeline. He knew absolutely nothing about her. The thought caused both panic and excitement. Hale asked what he did for a living. Dan said he was opening a coffee shop. She raised her eyebrows, asked where. He described the basement. Haley said she knew the place, that it was creepy walking past it at night, that there were rats. Dan said he'd already evicted the rats. Haley laughed, loudly, uninhibitedly. Dan stood there, listening to that laughter. A new sound, unfamiliar, beautiful. He couldn't predict it and couldn't control it. He just stood there and listened. Haley said she'd stop by when it opened. Dan nodded. She went back to her place. He stood on the stairs for another minute. Then he went down to the street and headed for his basement. There was a lot of work to do. The walls needed cleaning. The counter needed sanding. He had to find a coffee machine. He had no money at all. But Dan knew this city like no one else. Over 4,000 years, he had walked every street, every dump, every warehouse. He knew that in the alley behind the monorail station, there was an old man who repaired appliances. He had a Breeze 7 coffee machine in his warehouse. Old, but in working order. The old man would give it to him for a token price if he brought him a watch part he'd been looking for 2 years. The part was in a trash can behind the Wayhouse workshop. Dan knew this because he'd rummaged through that bin out of boredom during one of his shifts. He went to get the part. He found it exactly where he remembered, a small bronze alloy gear. He brought it to the old man. The old man looked at the part. He looked at Dan. He asked where it came from. Dan shrugged and said he'd found it by accident. The old man didn't believe him but took the gear. He gave him the coffee machine. Dan hauled it across half the city on his back. Heavy, old. It smelled of oil and copper. Perfect. He set it up behind the counter, plugged it in. The machine hummed. It coughed up a cloud of steam. It started working. Dan stood there, watching it the way others watch the sunrise. Then he started scrubbing the walls. He worked until evening. His hands were buzzing. His back ached. But it was a good kind of pain. Real, not the kind from a loop. In a loop, the pain would be gone by morning, but this one would stay. The calluses would hurt tomorrow, and that was wonderful. By evening, he had washed the floor and arranged 3 chairs he'd found by the trash cans in a nice neighborhood. One was wobbly. He fixed it in a minute. Over thousands of years, he'd learned to fix everything: clocks, locks, wiring, people. The last one was the hardest. There was a knock at the door. Dan opened it. Ji-woo Song was standing on the threshold. No apron, no house crest, just regular clothes. Her face was stony. Her eyes were red. She asked who he was. Her voice was steady, but her fingers on the bag strap had turned white. Dan said his name was Dan Hale, that he was flat, that he was opening a coffee shop. Ji-woo said that wasn't an answer to her question. She wanted to know how he knew the recipe. Dan was silent for 3 seconds. He couldn't tell the truth. If he said he'd lived for thousands of years in a loop, they'd think he was crazy or turn him into Kronos Lab, the corporation that had monopolized time travel. They were already looking for the anchor, the person in whom the loop had collapsed. If they found out he was the anchor, it would all end very quickly. Dan said he had good intuition. Ji-woo pressed her lips together. She said that was a lie, that no intuition could possibly know the recipe she'd come up with at 16 and never told anyone. Dan looked at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders. He saw how she was trying to keep a straight face. He saw the small scar on her wrist from a burn. She'd burned herself on a steam pipe when she was 14. Her father had said that the heiress of the house had no right to make mistakes. Dan knew that. He knew 1,000 little things about her, but he couldn't say them. He answered simply. He said that sometimes people see others better than those people see themselves, that he wasn't a spy or gifted, just a person who pays attention. Ji-woo stood. In the doorway, she looked at the empty room, at the old coffee machine, at the 3 chairs by the counter, at this strange, flat-faced guy who spoke as if he were 1,000 years old instead of 19. She asked why he was opening a coffee shop in the basement. Dan said he wanted to brew coffee. Not for show, for people. Jiwoo flinched. The word show hit the mark. She hadn't said that word to anyone. She'd only thought it every day. Standing behind the counter of the family coffee shop in an apron with the family crest. She turned and left without saying goodbye. Dan closed the door, sat down on a wobbly chair, looked at the ceiling. He'd done it again, said too much. Revealed too much. For 4,000 years, he'd been talking to himself. He'd lost the habit of filtering, lost the habit of realizing that words hurt. In the loop, they didn't hurt. In the morning, everyone forgot. And now, Jiwoo Song was walking down a dark street, thinking about the word showcase. And it was his fault. Dan rubbed his face with his hands. He needed to learn all over again. Learn to be careful, learn to keep quiet, learn not to know. He took a bag of coffee beans out of his backpack. The only luxury he allowed himself. He loaded it into the car, brewed a cup, the first cup in his first real coffee shop, for himself. He took a sip. It's bitter, a little sour. Cheap beans, but it's his coffee, in his place. In a new world where tomorrow will be different. He drank and smiled in the empty basement. Outside the windows, the legs of passers-by flashed in the lamplight. None of them knew that beneath them sat a man who was 4,000 years old, and that he was happy simply because the coffee tasted bitter in a new way. The coffee shop opened on the 5th day. No sign, no advertising. Dan simply opened the door and placed a chalkboard on the steps on which he wrote a single word, coffee. For the first 2 hours, no one came in. Dan stood behind the counter and wiped the cups. 3 of them, that was all he had. He'd bought them at a flea market. One had a crack. He filled it with gold lacquer. It turned out beautifully. Kintsugi, the Japanese technique for repairing broken ceramics. He'd studied it around 2000 out of sheer boredom. His first customer was an old man from the house across the street. He came in because he saw the sign and figured it was cheap here. Dan looked at him. 2 seconds. He noticed the limp in his left leg, a paint stain on his cuff, the yellowed fingers of his right hand. He used to smoke a lot years, quit recently, missing someone, bags under his eyes, sleeps poorly, a ring mark on his ring finger, a widower. Dan knew this old man. On his daily walk, he passed by the house at exactly 8:17 every day. He was going to the workshop, picture frames. Once Dan stopped by, and they talked until evening. The old man said his wife loved coffee with cardamom and honey, thick, almost like syrup. After she died, he couldn't drink coffee at all. The smell. Dan made him coffee with cardamom and honey, thick, almost like syrup. He set it on the counter. The old man raised the cup to his face. He inhaled. He froze. His eyes glistened. He didn't ask anything. He just drank in small sips and said nothing. Then he stood up. He placed a bill on the counter that was 5 times the price of the cup. Dan wanted to give him change. The old man shook his head and left. He didn't look back. But Dan saw him wipe his eyes with his sleeve. The second customer was a girl of about 12 in a school uniform. She ran in to warm up. She had no money. Dan made her a hot chocolate for free, with marshmallows. She drank it in 3 gulps. She asked why it tasted so good. Dan said it was a secret. There was no secret, just good chocolate and the right temperature, 68 degrees, not too hot. For a child, he knew this because he'd studied children's cooking for 3 years in one of his stints. Just for the hell of it. to keep from going crazy. The third customer was a guy in a courier uniform, soaked from the rain, angry. Dan made him an espresso, a double, no sugar, strong as a punch, just what a person who's angry and freezing needs. The guy drank it, standing up, nodded, left. An hour later, he returned with 2 friends. By lunchtime, 11 people had visited the coffee shop. Each got their drink, not the one they ordered, the one they needed. Dan didn't ask what they wanted. He looked for 2 seconds and brewed. People left in a strange silence. Not everyone understood what had happened, but everyone felt that this coffee was different. Not better, not tastier. More precisely, as if someone had looked inside and brewed exactly what they found there. By evening, rumors were spreading through the neighborhood. The flat guy in the basement brews coffee that gets right inside you. No one could explain it better. Gets right inside. On the 6th day, there were more customers. On the 7th, Dan had to buy 2 more cups. He named the coffee shop. He wrote it on the chalkboard. Day 1. Hale Mason showed up on the 7th day. She barged in noisily, with a wet umbrella, with a laptop under her arm. She sat down at the counter and said she'd come to check if he was lying about the coffee shop. She looked around. She took in the basement-like space. She said it was a bit gloomy. Dan said he was working on it. Hale asked what she'd be getting. Dan looked at her, at the traces of cheap ink on her fingers, at the laptop covered in news portal stickers, at the dark circles from lack of sleep, at the nails bitten down to the quick, anxiety hidden behind loudness and bravado. He didn't know her story. For the first time in thousands of interactions, he was reading a person not from memory, but for real, from scratch. Like the first time, it was exciting and scary. He made her a latte with lavender and vanilla. Creamy, warm, soothing. He set a slice of toast with avocado butter next to it. Hale looked at the toast. She asked how he knew she hadn't had breakfast. Dan nodded at her hands. He said that someone who bites their nails and skips breakfast is usually writing a thesis or an article that isn't going well. Hale opened her mouth, closed it, then laughed, said he was creepy, but she ate the toast and drank the latte and stayed sitting at the counter for 3 hours, tapping away at the keys. When she left, she said she'd come back tomorrow, and she did. And the next day, too, she started coming every morning. She sat down in her spot, the 3rd chair on the left. The very one that used to wobble. She wrote articles for a student portal. Sometimes she read aloud the particularly good paragraphs. Dan listened and nodded. He didn't understand half of the local realities she wrote about. New times, new events. But he listened because her voice was a new sound, unpredictable, alive. On the 9th day, what Dan had feared happened. He was walking down an alley in the evening. He was coming back from the store with a bag of beans. 3 guys blocked his path. Gifted ones. Small time. The kind who make a living off petty racketeering on the border of neighborhoods. One of them said the flat-chested guy had wandered into the wrong place. Dan looked at them. The first one, right-handed, weight on his left leg, a habit of throwing a right straight, a slow punch, a wide swing, leaves his ribs open. The second, left-handed, nervous. He'll clench the gift into a fist and try to land a powerful punch. But the gift is weak, no more than a spark. The third, not a fighter, just there to make up the numbers. He'll be the first to run. Dan knew their every move a quarter of a second before they made it. Not by magic, by experience. Thousands of sparring sessions, thousands of fights, thousands of bodies. He hadn't studied martial arts for years, for millennia. Every style in the city, every school, every movement, until he stopped thinking and just knew. The first one struck. Dan shifted half a step to the left. The fist by. Dan placed his palm on the guy's elbow and gently pushed. The guy lost his balance and sat down on the ground. Gently, painlessly. The second one clenched his fist. A spark of the gift flared on his knuckles. Dan caught his wrist and twisted his hand so that the spark went out on its own. He let go. The guy stood there, not understanding what had happened. The third one ran off, just as expected. The whole thing took 4 seconds. Dan picked up the bag of beans he'd set on the ground earlier. He looked at the 2 remaining guys. He said calmly that they'd better not work on this corner because the territory's boss would change in a week, and the new one wouldn't be so patient. The guys exchanged glances. They left. Dan stood in the alley. His hands weren't shaking. His breathing was steady. His heart was calm. It had all been too easy, and that was scary. 4,000 years of training were imprinted so deeply in his body that it moved on its own. His muscles remembered. His joints knew. He wasn't fighting. He was simply moving people through space with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Dan went home. He made himself some coffee in the kitchen. He sat by the window. The cat jumped onto his lap. He stroked her and thought about how, in 9 days of his new life, he'd already managed to scare one girl by knowing her secret and take down 2 gifted individuals in 4 seconds. He needed to be quieter. He needs to be more careful. He needs to be just a guy who makes coffee in the basement, not an archive of millennia, just a guy. He finished his coffee. He went to bed. And for the first time in thousands of years, he had a dream. The second week began with rain. Arcadia Central looked different in the rain. Neon signs blurred in the puddles. The monorail hissed along the wet tracks. People huddled under awnings. Dan stood at the entrance to the coffee shop and watched the rain. He hadn't seen rain in 4,000 years. In the loop, the day was sunny. Every time, the same blue sky, the same temperature. The same fish-shaped cloud at 2:32 p.m. Now water was pouring from the sky. Cold, real, unpredictable. Dan stepped out onto the steps. He turned his face up. Drops ran down his cheeks and chin. He stood like that for a minute, maybe 2, just feeling it. Then he wiped his face with his sleeve and went back behind the counter. His eyes were wet, not just from the rain. Hale arrived at her usual time, soaked to the bone. She'd forgotten her umbrella. She was cursing the weather. Dan silently handed her a towel. She dried her hair and asked why he was smiling. Dan said he loved the rain. Hale snorted and said he was weird. She sat down at the counter, opened her laptop, started typing. Then she stopped and said she was writing an article for a student portal about the flat ones, about how the gifted had monopolized prestigious professions while the flat ones were forced to work in service jobs, about social inequality tied to innate gift. Dan listened. Hale spoke passionately. She waved her arms. She nearly knocked over her cup. She was a flat one herself, without a gift, without privileges, without a chance to get into the academy. Journalism was her way of banging her head against a wall. Dan saw in her the same anger he'd seen in thousands of flat people over thousands of years. But with Hale, the anger was hot, alive, unbroken. He made her a second latte with lavender. He placed a napkin next to it on which he'd written a single sentence, the very one her article could begin with. Powerful, precise. Hale read it, looked at him, asked how he knew that was exactly what she'd been trying to put into words all day. Dan shrugged. He said he'd just been listening. Hale was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said quietly that no one had ever listened to her like that. Usually, people waited until she was done so they could have their say. But he listened. For real. The moment hung in the air. Then Hale shook herself and said he was still weird, but she tucked the napkin into her pocket. After lunch, the man Dan had been both waiting for and dreading arrived. A man in a gray suit, smooth, polite, a soft smile. He introduced himself as an employee of the city inspectorate. He asked about the business license. Dan showed him the documents. Everything was in order. He'd filed them correctly. Over thousands of years, he'd studied every bureaucratic procedure in the city. He knew every form, every stamp, every loophole. The man looked over the documents. He nodded. Then he looked around. He looked at the coffee machine, at the walls, at the 3 cups and 5 chairs. At Dan. He asked how long he'd been in the neighborhood. Dan said not long. The man smiled and left. Dan stood behind the counter and watched him go. He wasn't an inspector. He could it in his micro-expressions. A smile too even, eyes too calm, questions too precise. A professional, an observer, either from the houses or from Kronos Lab. They'd started looking. Dan knew it would happen sooner or later. Things around him were acting strangely. Echo anomalies. Minor glitches in the fabric of reality. A cat that walked up to him like an old friend even though it was seeing him for the first time. A flower vendor who greeted him every morning even though they weren't acquainted. People on the street who turned to look at him with the feeling that they'd seen him somewhere before. The world around Dan remembered. The loop had left a mark. Thousands of repetitions of a single day had imprinted themselves on reality like a finger in soft clay. And someone had started to notice chronographs, Kronos Lab security. They were recording anomalies all over the city, looking for the anchor, the person in whom the loop had collapsed. They didn't know who it was. Not yet, anyway. Dan washed the cups, closed the coffee shop, stepped out into the rain, walked home along the long road, checked for any tail, changed his route, habits from the loop. Back then, he did it out of boredom. Now, out of necessity. A surprise awaited him at home. Ji-woo Song was sitting on the steps, in the rain, without an umbrella. Her hair was wet. Her perfect hairstyle was ruined. She looked younger, simpler, more human. She said she wanted to try his coffee. Dan opened the coffee shop door, let her in, turned on the light. He lit a small lamp above the counter. Ji-woo sat down on a chair. She looked around. She said it was cramped in here. Dan agreed. He said he liked it cramped. Spacious rooms made him nervous. He didn't explain why. He didn't say that he'd spent 4,000 years in a small rented room and had gotten used to walls close by. That open spaces caused him mild panic because in the loop, the world had been small and closed off. He just made coffee for her, not by the Songhouse standard, not by the rules, not perfect, personal. He could see she was tired. He could see she'd had a fight with her father. He could see she'd been crying recently. Her eyelids were red. He made her something mild, with nut milk, with a hint of dark chocolate bitterness, with a single drop of orange oil. Not her childhood recipe. Something new? For her today? Ji-woo took a sip, closed her eyes, opened them, looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. It was a new expression, not from the loop. She asked quietly how he did it. Dan said he was just brewing coffee. Ji-woo shook her head. She said no. He was doing something else. All her life, she'd been taught that coffee was a technique. Precision, control, temperature, pressure, grind. But he brews as if he's talking to a person through that person through the cup. Dan was silent. She'd hit the nail on the head. That was exactly what he was doing, talking through coffee, because he was worse with words. 4,000 years of silence do that to a person. Ji-woo finished her coffee. She stood up. She said she'd come back, and left. She turned around at the door. She said her name was Jiwoo, just Jiwoo, without song. Dan nodded. That was important. She had separated herself from the house, if only for a second, even if only here, in a cramped basement with cloudy windows and cracked cups, but she had separated herself. Dan closed the coffee shop. He went up to his place. The cat was waiting on the windowsill. He fed her. He lay down on the bed. Rain was tapping on the window. A new sound. Unpredictable. Beautiful. He counted the raindrops until he fell asleep. He woke up in the morning, and his first thought wasn't about the loop, not about millennia, not about Kronos Lab. His first thought was that he needed to buy more cups because 5 weren't enough anymore. It was a good thought. Small, human, normal. He smiled at the ceiling. He got up. He started a new day. On the 10th day since the loop broke, the first day coffee shop already had 20 regular customers. The old man with the cardamom came every day at exactly 9. The courier stopped by after his shift. The girl in her school uniform popped in on her way home and got a free chocolate bar. Hale lived behind the counter. Jiwoo came in the evenings. Quietly, she sat in the corner. She drank coffee. Sometimes she and Dan talked. Sometimes they didn't. The silence was fine for both of them. Rumors were spreading. The flat guy who sees right through people. The basement coffee shop, where they give you what you need. The strange guy with the old man's eyes. Dan heard all of this and tried not to react. Quieter, more inconspicuous. Just a guy, just coffee. But he knew the silence wouldn't last long. Of an old man. Dan heard it all and tried not to react. Quieter, more inconspicuous. Just a guy, just coffee. But he knew the silence wouldn't last long. The man in the gray suit would return, and he'd bring more serious people with him. Week 3. The coffee shop was open every day from 7 in the morning until 9 at night. Dan didn't get tired. The 19-year-old's body was strong, and his discipline was that of a man who had been getting up at the same time for 4,000 years. The morning routine didn't change. Wake up, the cat, the toaster, down to the basement, loading the beans, warming up the machine, opening the door, the chalkboard on the steps. Today, he wrote on the board, rain, coffee, good. Hale arrived at 8, earlier than usual. Her face was pale, her eyes were red. She sat down at the counter and said nothing. She just rested her head in her hands. Dan didn't ask what was wrong. He made her coffee, not a lavender latte like usual. A strong cappuccino with cinnamon and a pinch of salt. A drink for a bad day. He set it down next to her. Hale lifted her head, took a sip. Sat there for a minute. Then she said her mother had called, asked when she'd stop messing around with nonsense and find a normal job, as a courier or in cleaning, just like all the others. Why does she need this journalism? Who needs her and her little articles? Hale said this in an even voice, without tears. But her fingers on the cup had turned white. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. When she finished, he said one sentence. He said her article about the inequality between the gifted and the shallow was powerful, that the first paragraph hit the mark, and that in a year people would be quoting that article. Hale looked at him. She asked how he knew. Dan said he could see it. Hale snorted. But her shoulders straightened. She opened her laptop and started typing faster than usual, more fiercely, more precisely. Dan stood behind the counter and thought that this was how it worked. No magic, no superpower, just the right words at the right moment, the right cup in the right hands. That was what he did best. Jiwoo arrived at noon for the first time during the day, not in the evening, for the first time. Not alone. A man was with her, tall, straight back, an expensive suit, a stern face, jaws clenched. Jiwoo's eyes, her father, the head of the songhouse. Jiwoo was pale and tense. Her father surveyed the basement with a single glance. His eyes swept over the walls, over the counter, over the crack in the cup sealed with gold lacquer, over Dan. He asked if this was the man. Ji-woo nodded. Her father turned to Dan. He introduced himself, Mr. Song. He said his daughter had told him about a strange man who knew things he shouldn't know. His voice was even, without threat, but without warmth either. A man accustomed to power. Dan looked at him. He saw everything. The fatigue he hid behind his sternness. The fear of losing control over his daughter. The pain after his wife's death 5 years ago, the habit of clenching his left fist when he's nervous. They'd met at the Loop many times. Mr. Song drove past every day in a black car at exactly 11:40. Once, Dan approached him in the park. They talked for 2 hours. The old man turned out not to be as tough as he seemed, just a lonely man who didn't know how to talk to his daughter after his wife's death. But that conversation had faded. Now a stranger stood before Dan, a stranger to him. Dan said he just made coffee. Mr. Song said that Flat didn't just make coffee if his daughter comes to the basement every evening instead of working at the family business. Dan said nothing. Ji-woo stood behind her father, her lips pressed together. She wanted to say something but couldn't in front of him. Dan saw it. He made coffee, 2 cups, one for Ji-woo, almond milk and dark chocolate, her drink, the second one for Mr. Song. Dan looked at him for 2 seconds. Then he made it. Black, no sugar, no milk, no additives, but at exactly 74 degrees. Not hot, because Mr. Song has sensitive gums after his treatment. He doesn't tell anyone about it. He drinks scalding coffee in public and winces discreetly, but at home, he drinks it warm. Dan knew this from the Loop. He set the cup down. Mr. Song took a sip, froze, looked at Dan. For the first time during the entire visit, something other than cold flashed in his eyes. Surprise, fleeting, brief, but Dan caught it. Mr. Song finished his coffee in silence, set down the cup, told his daughter they were leaving. Ji-woo walked over to the counter. She picked up her cup, took a sip, looked at Dan. There was a question in her eyes, the same one as on the first day. Who are you? Dan nodded slightly. Later, not now, they left. Dan washed the cups and thought about what had just happened. Mr. Song would come back. Dan could see it in his face. A man who, for the first time in years, had drunk coffee at the right temperature wouldn't forget it. And he would think and ask questions. That was dangerous. The head of the house wasn't just any customer. He's a man with resources and connections. If he starts digging, Dan will find himself under a magnifying glass. But Dan couldn't brew bad coffee on purpose. He didn't know how. For 4,000 years, he'd learned to do it perfectly. For a specific person, to deliberately make it worse was like a musician playing off key. Physically, he could. Internally, he wouldn't let himself. That evening, after the coffee shop closed, something else happened. Dan was walking home along his usual route. He turned into an alley. And he saw it. A sign was flashing on the wall of a building. A standard advertising panel. Laundromat. Open 24 hours. It was flashing just like it was on a loop, at exactly the same interval, once every 3 seconds. But during one of the flashes, Dan saw it, or felt it, a split-second glitch. The sign flashed not after 3 seconds, but after 2. Then it returned to its rhythm, an echo anomaly, small, almost imperceptible. But Dan noticed it because he knew the rhythm of that sign like his own heartbeat. The world around him remembered the loop, and sometimes it slipped. Things returned to their old rhythm. For a split second, people greeted him as if he were an acquaintance. Cats walked toward him. Doors opened a little more easily. Little things, but little things that Kronos Lab's sensitive instruments could detect. Dan quickened his pace. At home, he sat by the window and thought. Time was working against him. The longer he stayed in one place, the more anomalies accumulated around him. The reality around him was like plasticine that had been pressed with a finger for too long. A dent remained, and now the world was trying to return to its original shape. But the dent wouldn't let it. He could leave, disappear, start over in another city. But he didn't want to. For the first time in thousands of years, he had a place. A coffee shop, 3 cups, 5 chairs, an old man with cardamom, a girl with chocolate. Hale behind the counter with a laptop, Jiwoo in the corner with a hazelnut latte. He couldn't give this up. Couldn't go back to being a nobody. A cat jumped onto his lap. Dan petted her and said aloud that he would stay. The cat meowed. Dan took that as consent. The next morning brought a new visitor, a woman, tall, put together, dark hair pulled back in a bun, dark circles under her eyes, a uniform jacket without insignia, but Dan recognized the cut. Chronographs, Kronos Lab security. She walked in, sat down, ordered black coffee. Dan looked at her. 2 seconds. Evelyn Cross, 22 years old, commissioner. He knew her. In the loop, she worked in a different department, but their paths had crossed. She had lost her younger brother in the first echo anomaly. She blamed herself. She worked herself to the bone to keep from thinking. She drank coffee by the liter. She didn't sleep. She smoked on the roof of headquarters at 3 in the morning. Dan knew all this, but she didn't know him. To her, he was a subject of observation, a flat from a district with anomalous readings. She came to watch. Dan made her coffee, black, just as she ordered. But with one change. He added a pinch of something, not to the coffee. In the brewing method, the temperature, the pressure, the extraction time, everything was adjusted so that the coffee was strong, but didn't burn an empty stomach because she hadn't had breakfast. He saw. Evelyn took a sip, nodded. Her face didn't change, but Dan noticed how her shoulders relaxed slightly. She sat there for 20 minutes. She looked around, taking it all in. Then she stood up, paid, said the coffee wasn't bad, left. Dan stood behind the counter. His hands were steady. His face was calm. Inside, he felt cold. They'd found the neighborhood. Soon, they'd find him. He looked at the chalkboard by the entrance. Day 1. He looked at the coffee machine, at the cups, at the chairs. This was his place, his first real place in 4,000 years. He wouldn't give it up. He just had to be smarter. Quieter, more precise, like good coffee. No frills, just what was needed. Evelyn Cross came the next day, and the next. Every morning at 8:30, she sat in the same chair, ordered black coffee, sat there for 20 minutes. She watched. She left. Dan made her coffee every time. He adjusted it to her mood. If she hadn't slept all night, he made it stronger. If she was tense, he lowered the temperature slightly so it would be milder. If she forgot to eat, he placed some toast next to her, silently, without comment. Evelyn didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't smile, but she ate the toast. On the 5th day of her visits, she asked her first question. She asked how long he'd been in Arcadia. Dan said, "A long time." She asked where he was from. Dan said, "From far away." She looked at him, straight on, without softness, the eyes of a professional accustomed to dissecting people into their constituent parts. She said he phrased things strangely. Like someone who chooses words not because they're looking for the right one, but because they're weeding out the unnecessary, as if they know too much and try to say too little. Dan was silent. She'd hit the nail on the head. Exactly. It hurt. He hadn't expected such insight from her. In the loop, Evelyn was different. 4 years younger, even before she lost her brother, even before the chronographs. Softer, this Evelyn was sharp, honed by grief and work. She knew how to see, not like Dan, in her own way. Through suspicion and analysis, Dan said he just didn't like unnecessary words. Evelyn finished her coffee. She stood up. At the door, she turned and said she'd be back tomorrow. It didn't sound like a client's promise, more like a warning. Dan washed her cup and thought she'd come to observe, to record, to report. He was an object, a dot on the map of anomalies. But he saw something else in her. He saw a woman who worked herself to the bone so she wouldn't feel guilty about her brother, who drank coffee instead of eating and slept 3 hours a night, who kept going on sheer willpower and self-loathing. He wanted to help her. And at the same time, he understood that helping her meant revealing himself. Every perfectly brewed cup of coffee was another clue. Every toast made at just the right moment was another anomaly in her report. He brewed coffee too well. It sounded absurd. But in a world where they were hunting you precisely for supernatural precision, it was a real problem. Hale noticed Evelyn on the third day. She asked who that gloomy woman was who came in every morning. Dan said she was just a customer. Hale narrowed her eyes and said that customers don't sit for 20 minutes over a single cup and stare at the walls as if they're counting the exits. Dan said nothing. Hale was observant, a journalist's instinct. Bad for him. Good for her. He did the subject. He asked how the article was coming along. Hale lit up and started talking. He listened. Every time she got carried away, her eyes changed. They became alive, bright. All her anxiety faded away. Only her passion for words and truth remained. Dan thought that if he could, he would listen to her forever. A new voice, new thoughts. Every sentence was unpredictable. Every idea was fresh. After 4,000 years of the same day, it was like water in the desert. At the end of the third week, 2 things happened. First, Ji Woo-song came by in the evening and brought coffee beans with her, good ones, from the Song House reserves. She set the bag on the counter and said it wasn't a gift. It was an exchange. She wanted Dan to show her how he brews it. Not the recipe, not the technique, but the other thing, the thing she can't understand, why his coffee resonates with people and hers doesn't. Dan looked at the beans. He looked at her. He said he'd show her, but not today. Ji-woo pressed her lips together. She said she wasn't used to waiting. Dan said he knew. She left. The beans remained. Dan opened the bag. The aroma. Rich, deep, high-altitude roasted Arabica. The Song House beans cost as much as he earned in a month. He loaded them into the machine. The second incident. That night, Dan woke up to a sound. Quiet, almost inaudible. A knock on the coffee shop door. He went downstairs, opened it. Standing on the threshold was a girl of about 8, soaked from the rain. Eyes red, lost. She was crying. Dan let her in. He sat her down behind the counter. He didn't call the police right away. He just got out some milk, cinnamon, honey. He made a hot drink, slowly, carefully. The girl watched his hands. She stopped crying. He set the cup in front of her. She took it with both hands. She sniffed it, froze. Her lips trembled. She said quietly that it smelled just like her mom. Dan nodded. He knew. This girl lived in a house 3 streets away. Her mother had died 2 years ago. She used to make milk with cinnamon and honey in the mornings. Every day. The girl would come into the kitchen barefoot and sit on a high stool. Her mother would pour it into a small cup. They would drink it together, in silence. It was their ritual. Dan knew this because in one of the loops he lived in the apartment next door and heard it through the wall. Thousands of times, every morning. He remembered the smell. He recalled it. The girl drank in small sips, Dan sat down across from her. He said he would wait with her, that he had nowhere to rush to, that he really wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. The girl looked at him. She nodded. They sat in silence. Rain pounded against the fogged-up windows. The lamp above the counter hummed. The coffee machine clicked quietly as it cooled down. Then the door opened. Hale walked in, wet, without an umbrella. She was walking by and saw the light. She saw the scene. A little girl behind the counter with a cup. Dan across from her. Silence. Hale sat down next to the girl. She asked her name. The girl said, May. Hale said it was a beautiful name. A minute later, the door opened again. Jiwoo. She was wet too. She was walking home and passed by. She saw the light. She came in. She saw the scene. She walked silently behind the counter. She turned on the kettle. She started making tea, as if she did this here every day. Then Mandy came in. Dan didn't know her. Redhead, in a leather jacket, loud. She lived 3 blocks away and was coming back from practice. She saw the light in the basement. She came in to warm up. She saw the girl. She left without a word. She came back a minute later with a blanket from her car. She draped it over May. She winked at her. She sat down in the corner. 5 people in a small basement in the middle of the night. Rain, warm milk. A blanket, a silence that doesn't weigh you down, but holds you. Dan sat there and watched at it. At the people who came not because they were called, not because they had to, because they saw the light and came in, because they saw the child and stayed. He felt something inside him crack, not break, open up. For 4,000 years, he had been alone, alone in a day that repeated itself, alone among people who forgot him in the morning, alone with his knowledge and his pain. And now, 4 strangers were sitting in his basement and silently doing the right things. No requests, no instructions, just because that's what had to be done. Evelyn called later. She didn't come in person, but she called city services. She found May's family. Her uncle arrived in half an hour. He took the girl away. May turned around at the door and thanked Dan for her mom's drink. Dan nodded. His throat tightened. When everyone had left, he remained alone in the coffee shop. He sat on the floor, with his back to the counter, just like on the first day. And he cried. Quietly. Silently. Not from pain. From the fact that for the first time in thousands of years, there were people around him. Real people. Living people. Who would remember this evening? Who wouldn't be erased tomorrow? A month. 30 days of a new life. Dan counted everyone, not out of habit, out of gratitude. Every morning, he woke up and lay motionless for the first 3 seconds, waiting for the reset, waiting for the ceiling to flicker, for the cat to be on the windowsill in the same pose, for the toaster to click at 7 o'clock too. There was no reset. The morning was new, and every time he exhaled with a relief that stung his eyes. The coffee shop had changed. Hale brought an old poster from her room and hung it on the wall. Jiwoo brought 3 new cups from the house's supplies. No crest. White, simple, beautiful. Mandy dragged a wooden bench from her father's workshop. She said people shouldn't have to sit on chairs from the trash. Dan accepted it all. Silently, with a gratitude he couldn't put into words, because words were too small for what he felt. Evelyn came every morning, but something was changing. At the end of the 3rd week, she stayed longer than 20 minutes for the first time. She sat for 40, then an hour. Her laptop was open in front of her, but she wasn't typing. She just sat there, drinking coffee, listening to Hale argue with Dan about whether you could put cardamom in a latte. Once, Dan noticed something on her face that could be taken for the shadow of a smile, fleeting, barely noticeable. But it was there. He understood what was happening. She came as an observer. She stayed as a person. The coffee shop did that to people. Not magic, not manipulation, just a place where you aren't judged, where they give you what you need, not what you ordered, where you can be silent and it's okay. Evelyn wasn't used to places like that. In the chronographs, everything was a function. Every conversation had a purpose. Every gesture was read. But here, Dan set coffee and toast in front of her and expected nothing in return. It threw her off balance more than any anomaly. At the start of the 4th week, Dan decided to show Ji-woo what she'd asked for. That evening, after closing, he asked her to stay. She stayed. She stood next to him behind the counter, shoulder to shoulder. Dan took out the beans. Her beans, Songhouse. He loaded them into the machine. He said he would now show her the difference. He brewed the first cup. Perfect by Songhouse standards. Exact temperature, exact pressure, exact grind. He set it in front of her. Ji-woo took a sip. She nodded. Flawless, just as she had been taught. Dan brewed a second cup from the same beans, with the same machine, but differently. He brewed it for Ji-woo, not for the heiress of the Songhouse, not for a barista, for the girl who had a fight with her father and came to the basement because here, for the first time, she didn't have to be perfect. Slightly lower temperature, slightly longer extraction, a drop of orange oil, not by the recipe, from memory based on the knowledge of who she is when no one is watching. Ji-woo took a sip of the second one, set the cup down. She was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that the first one was better technically, but the second one was hers. Dan nodded. He said that was the difference. Technique makes perfect coffee. Attention makes coffee for a specific person. Ji-woo stood next to him, close. He could smell her shampoo. Floral, expensive. In the loop, she used a different one. A new detail. Unpredictable. Beautiful. She asked how he knew what kind of coffee she needed. Dan said he was watching. Ji-woo said everyone was watching, but only he could see. Dan said nothing. She turned toward him. She stood close. She looked up at him. She asked why he was doing this. Why brew for everyone? Why waste yourself on strangers? Dan thought for 5 seconds. Then he told the truth. Not all of it, just a piece. He said he'd been alone for a very long time, that he'd forgotten why people were needed, and that coffee was his way of remembering. Every cup is a conversation. Every drink is an attempt to tell a person that they're seen, that they're not alone, that someone had spent 3 minutes of their life to make him exactly what he needed. Ji-woo was silent. Then she said that was the saddest and most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. Then she left. Quickly, she almost ran away. Dan stood behind the counter and smiled. She was scared, not of him, of herself. That his words had gotten to her. That she wanted to stay. The heiress of the Songhouse shouldn't want to stay in the basement with a flat-chested guy, but she did. The next day, what Dan had been waiting for happened. An anomaly. A big one. In the middle of the day, he was standing behind the counter pouring milk when the world around him jerked. For a split second, the cup in his hand grew heavier, then lighter, then normal again. The milk in the pitcher flowed upward for a moment. Hale, behind the counter, blinked and said she felt dizzy. The customer by the window rubbed his eyes. The lamp flickered. That was it. A second, maybe 2. But Dan knew what it was. A temporal glitch. Reality around him had cracked. The loop that had been spinning in one spot for 4,000 years had left a scar in the fabric of the world. And the scar was pulsing. Chronographs will record this. Sensors all over the city. They're mapping the anomalies. And a new point would appear right here in his coffee shop. Dan set down his cup. His hands weren't shaking. His face was calm. Inside, he was cold. He looked at Hale, who was rubbing her temples, at the customer finishing his coffee, oblivious to everything, at the fogged-up windows, at the first day sign. Time was running out. They would come, soon. He had to be ready. That evening, after closing, for the first time in his new life, he sat down and began to remember, not facts, not names, not roots, magic. In Arcadia, magic is tied to emotional memory. The deeper you felt the moment, the more precisely you could reproduce it as a spell. Dan had lived 4,000 years of loneliness, of fear, of boredom, of quiet joys, of tiny discoveries. His emotional archive was richer than that of any master in the city. He could cast any spell if he found the right memory, but there was a price. Every time he used deep magic, he opened a door to those millennia, and from there, emptiness lashed out, not pain. Emptiness, thousands of years of loneliness sewn into him forever. After a powerful spell, he would be almost incapable of feeling for a day. Affection vanished, warmth vanished. He looked at people and didn't understand why he needed them. Then it would let go. But every time, he feared it wouldn't let go. That one day, the emptiness would forever. So he conserved his energy. He solved problems with coffee, with conversation, with attention, not with magic. Magic was a last resort, a nuclear button. He sat in the darkness of the coffee shop and sifted through his memories. 4,000 years, every day the same. But every time he lived it differently. Once he spent the whole day in the library. Once he fought in the arena. Once he sat on the roof and looked at the city. Once he cried. Once he laughed until his stomach hurt. Once he didn't leave the room. Once he learned a new language. Once he forgot the old one. 4,000 years, 1.5 million repetitions of a single day, and every day he remained human. That was his greatest achievement. Not swords, not magic, not languages. Humanity. He hadn't lost it, though he should have, though he could have, though he'd wanted to 1,000 times. He stood up, went outside, looked at the sky. Stars in the loop, they were all the same. Now one twinkled, the other didn't. A new sky. His sky. He smiled and went home to sleep. They came 3 days after the anomaly. Not Evelyn, others. 2 men in gray suits. They walked into the coffee shop at 11 a.m., sat down, ordered coffee. Dan looked at them. 2 seconds. Chronographs. Field agents. Not the kind who observe, the kind who act. The first one. Broad shoulders, military haircut, a scar on his left arm, a combat mage. Time rewind. Can rewind his movement 1 second. Useful in combat. The second one. Skinny, nervous, his fingers are constantly moving. An analyst, an anomaly scanner. He has a device in his pocket, small, about the size of a phone. It detects temporal distortions within a 50-meter radius. Dan knew both of these types. In the loop, he'd crossed paths with chronographs hundreds of times, studied their structure, protocols, gestures, code. He could have passed their check with his eyes closed. But he didn't. He just made coffee. 2 black coffees. Plain. No tweaks, no tricks. Just coffee. He set them down. The men drank and chatted among themselves. Quietly. About soccer, about the weather, standard small talk. Dan wasn't listening. He was watching the other one. His hand in his pocket. The device was working, scanning. Dan knew what the device would show. Background. Normal background. Because the anomalies didn't occur constantly, they pulsed in bursts. Between bursts, everything was clear. He just had to avoid creating a new flash while they were here. Not to worry, not to feel too strongly, because the anomalies were tied to him, to his memory, to his presence. When he was calm, the world around him was calm too. When he felt deeply, the world around him began to remember the loop. He stood behind the counter, breathing evenly, his face. The men finished their drinks. They stood up. The first one put his money on the counter. The second one lingered. He looked at Dan. He asked what the coffee shop was called. Dan said, "The first day." The man nodded. They left. Dan exhaled. His hands were trembling slightly. He hid them under the counter. Hale came in an hour later. She saw his face and asked what was wrong. Dan said nothing was wrong. Hale sat down behind the counter and said he was lying, that she was a journalist and could tell when people were lying. Dan looked at her stubborn face, at the ink stains on her fingers, at her bitten nails. He wanted to tell her everything about the loop, about 4,000 years, about how he knows this city better than anyone alive, about how he's being hunted. But he couldn't, because then she'd be in danger. Knowing about the anchor isn't a secret. It's a target on your back. He said he was just tired. Hale looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Okay." But her tone made it clear she didn't believe him and wouldn't back down. That same evening, Evelyn came by, not at her usual time. Later, after 10, the coffee shop was already closed. She knocked. Dan opened the door. Evelyn was standing in the doorway without her uniform jacket, in her regular clothes. Her hair was down, her face was tired. She said she hadn't come for work. Dan let her in. He made coffee. He set it down. She wrapped both hands around the cup and sat in silence. Then she spoke. She said today was the anniversary. Her brother, Kim. He was 15 when the first echo anomaly hit the area where he was walking, a 6-second time loop, a small one, harmless by Kronos Lab standards. But Kim was right in the middle of it. Those 6 seconds repeated for him for 4 hours. When the anomaly closed, he was conscious but not here. His eyes looked but didn't see. He spent a month in the clinic. Then he started talking. But he stopped smiling. Evelyn fell silent. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. Then he stood up. He went behind the counter and did what he shouldn't have done. He made tea, exactly the way Kim used to make it. In the loop, Dan knew Kim. The boy lived 2 blocks away. Every morning, he made tea for his sister, green tea, with jasmine, 1½ spoons of sugar. He stirred it counterclockwise, a habit. Dan had seen it 1,000 times through the window. He set the cup in front of Evelyn. She took it. She sniffed it. Her hands stopped. She looked at Dan. Her eyes were glassy. She said quietly that this tea smelled like the one her brother used to make for her. Dan nodded. She asked how. Her voice cracked in the middle of the word. Dan said he'd guessed. Evelyn shook her head. She said no, he hadn't guessed. 1½ spoons of sugar, jasmine, counterclockwise. It's impossible to guess that. She looked at him. The professional inside her kicked in. He saw the analytical module switch on behind her wet eyes. How she started putting it all together. The coffee that's always just right. Knowledge of the little things. Dear. Whose recipe? Now, Kim's tea. Anomalies in the area. The flat one, whose surroundings know him better than they should. She understood, not everything, but enough. She set down the cup. Her hands were shaking. She said he was the anchor. Dan was silent. 3 seconds. 5. He could have denied it, could have come up with an explanation, but he looked into her eyes and didn't see a hunter there. He saw a sister who had just caught the scent of tea on her brother's hands and couldn't lie to her. He nodded once, briefly. Evelyn closed her eyes, opened them. She stood up, walked across the cafe, stopped at the door, stood with her back to him, her shoulders tense. She was torn. He could see it in every muscle. Duty told her to turn him in, to call, to report. The anchor had been found, coordinates, status, everything by the book. But on the counter stood a cup of jasmine tea with a spoon and a half of sugar. She turned around, said she didn't know what to do. Dan said he knew. He said she had time, that he wasn't going anywhere, that she could come tomorrow and the day after and think as long as she needed to, that the tea would be waiting. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped out into the night. Dan sat down on the floor. He exhaled. She knew. The first person in the new world who knew the truth, or part of the truth. And he couldn't predict what she would do. It was scary. And right, because unpredictability is what it means to live. Evelyn didn't come the next day, or the day after that. 3 days of an empty chair at 8:30. Dan made coffee, served customers, smiled. Inside, he counted the minutes. If she had turned him in, he had 2 to 6 hours after the decision. The chronograph protocol, he knew it by heart. First, verification of the report, then approval of the operation, then the capture team. 2 to 6 hours, but if she turned him in, they would have already arrived. 3 days had passed, so she was silent, thinking, or simply unable to bring herself to press the button. On the 4th day, she returned at 8:30, as usual. She sat down in her chair, ordered black coffee. Dan brewed it, set it down, a toast next to it. She took a sip, looked at him, said one sentence, said she needed time. Dan nodded. They didn't speak again that day, but she stayed for an hour. And when Hale came in, sat down next to her, and started complaining about the editor who'd rejected her article, Evelyn looked at her for the first time not as an observer, but as someone who listens to other people's problems. Hale noticed. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Dan. She asked when the gloomy woman had become her friend. Dan shrugged. Hale snorted and went back to her complaints. Evelyn lowered her head slightly. Dan could have sworn she was hiding a smile. At the end of the 4th week, Dan received a letter, an official one, on letterhead with the seal of the Seven Towers Academy Council. He was invited to the preliminary selection for the Seven Towers tournament as a promising flat, a social inclusion program. It sounded nice. It was a trap. Dan knew it. The Seven Towers tournament took place once a year. The gifted from the best academies, heirs of the houses, battle mages, masters of the gift. Flat people were never allowed in. Theoretically, anyone could apply. In practice, a flat person's chances of surviving the first round were close to 0. And now they'd sent him an invitation, personally, with a seal. Someone up there had decided to bring him into the spotlight, to see what he was capable of, or to provoke him into displaying his power in front of cameras and thousands of spectators. Dan set the letter on the counter. Hale grabbed it first. She read it. Her eyes lit up. She said it was unbelievable, that a nobody was being invited to the tournament for the first time, that this was material for the story of the year. Dan said he wasn't going to participate. Hale looked at him as if he'd refused to breathe. She asked why. Dan said he didn't want the attention. Hale stood up, hands on her hips, her voice a half-tone higher. She said he didn't understand, that this was a chance, not for him, for all the flat ones, for every courier and janitor and delivery person in this city. If a flat one steps into the arena and doesn't crumble in the first second, it will prove that the system is lying, that the gift gift isn't everything, that people without it are worth something too. Dan listened. She was right. He knew she was right, but he also knew that the tournament is an arena. Cameras, thousands of eyes, chronographs, homes, Kronos Lab, everyone looking for anchors. Stepping into the arena meant stepping into the spotlight, and he wanted the shadows. He wanted his basement, his cups, his quiet life. Jiwoo came by that evening. She saw the letter. She turned pale. She said she knew who was behind it. The Academy Council doesn't send out invitations like that on its own. Someone from the houses had put pressure on them. She didn't know who exactly, but she knew it wasn't a gift. Dan asked what she thought. Jiwoo was silent. Then she said that if he stepped into the arena, she would have to fight against him. She was the heiress of the Song House. Her participation in the tournament had been decided from the moment she was born. Dan looked at her. She looked at him. Something heavy hung between them. She would be his rival in front of the whole city. And they both knew he was stronger. That 4,000 years against 19 wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. Jiwoo said that if he went out there, he shouldn't humiliate her. Her voice was steady, but there was a plea in it, a real one, a fragile one. Dan said quietly that he never would. She nodded. She left. Dan sat alone in the coffee shop, a letter on the counter, a cat on his lap. He thought. Hale said this was a chance for the flat ones. Jiwoo said it was a trap. Evelyn didn't say anything, but he knew the chronographs would be at the tournament, with cameras, with sensors, with orders to find the anchors. If he used magic in the arena, they would see. They'd record it. They'd figure it out. If he didn't use it, he'd lose in the first round, and it would all be for nothing. Option 3. Win without magic, just with his body. Just with martial arts. 4,000 years of training against young gifted ones without a single spell, pure technique. It's possible for the early rounds, for the later ones hardly, but he could try. He could show that a flat one is capable of standing in the arena with the gifted ones. Not to win, just to stand. That was enough. Dan picked up the letter, turned it over. On the back, in small handwriting, he wrote a single word: yes. In the morning, he delivered the reply. The news spread within a day. The flat one from the basement coffee shop is going to the tournament of the 7 towers. Some laughed. Others tapped their fingers against their temples. Still others quietly hoped. 3 times as many people as usual came to the coffee shop that day. Couriers, cleaners, salespeople, flats. They didn't order coffee. They just stood there. They watched Dan. One of them, an old man with cardamom, raised his cup and nodded. Silently. Dan nodded back. His throat tightened. He didn't want to be a symbol. Didn't want to be hope. He wanted to brew coffee. But sometimes coffee isn't enough. Sometimes you have to stand up. Mandy came in that evening. He was seeing her for the second time since that night with the girl named May, redhead, leather jacket, calloused hands. She barged into the coffee shop and said she'd heard the news, said he was an idiot, that they'd knock him out in the first round. Then she sat down and said she'd train him. Dan looked at her. Mandy Rice, 20 years old, champion of the lower-class street fights, daughter of a garage owner, gifted with superhuman strength. She could bend a steel pipe with her bare hands. Dan knew her from the loops. He'd seen her fights. She fought beautifully, dirty, honest. No unnecessary movements, pure strength and instinct. He said he didn't need a trainer. Mandy said everyone says that. Then they step into the ring and get punched in the face. Dan said he knew how to fight. Mandy snorted. She stood up. She said, "Show me." Dan looked at her. He stepped out of his stance. Mandy took her stance, relaxed. Familiar, center of gravity low, hands loose, readiness in every muscle. She was good, really good, for her level. But Dan was on a different level. He took a step. Mandy struck, quickly, a straight right, amplified by the gift. The air hummed. Her fist passed a centimeter from his face. Dan didn't dodge. He simply wasn't where she was aiming. He shifted before she even started to strike because he could tell from the tension in her shoulder where the punch was going. 0.3 seconds before it started. Mandy struck again. And again. 3 strikes in 2 seconds. Each one missed. Dan moved smoothly. No jerks. Like water. He didn't dodge. He just wasn't there. On the 4th strike, he placed his hand on her shoulder, lightly, without pressure. Mandy froze. She realized that if he'd wanted to, it would have been to the throat, or the temple, or the solar plexus. But he placed his hand on her shoulder, gently. Mandy stood there, staring at him, eyes wide open. She'd punched through walls, bent pipes, defeated the gifted in the ring, and the skinny guy in an apron effortlessly took all her punches and placed his hand on her shoulder, as if petting a cat. She exhaled. She said 2 words. What the hell? Dan took his hand away, went back behind the counter, made her some coffee, strong, with pepper, with ginger, for a fighter, for a woman who had just missed 4 times in a row for the first time in her life. Mandy took the cup, took a sip, looked at him over the rim, said she'd still be training him because fighting isn't just about hitting and dodging, it's about performing in front of a crowd, in front of cameras, in front of judges, and that he definitely didn't know. Dan thought. She was right. For 4,000 years, he'd fought in empty halls, on empty streets, without spectators, without bets. The arena is different. He nodded. Mandy nodded back, finished her coffee, said that tomorrow at 6 in the morning in the courtyard behind her father's auto shop. Don't be late. And she left, slamming the door so hard the glasses rattled. Dan stood behind the counter. Mandy Rice, loud, red-headed, as honest as a punch in the face. He smiled. Another new person, another unpredictability, another reason to wake up tomorrow. Training with Mandy began the next morning. The yard behind the auto shop, 6 in the morning, cold. Mandy stood in a sports top and shorts, as if the temperature didn't affect her. Dan showed up in an old jacket. Mandy told him to take it off. The jacket restricted his movement. Dan took it off. Mandy looked him over. Skinny, doesn't look like a fighter. She shook her head and said that in the ring, looks are half the battle. The audience decides who to root for in the first 3 seconds. A skinny guy in baggy pants loses before the fight even starts. Dan said he didn't care what the audience thought. Mandy said he didn't care. But the nobodies did. Every delivery guy and every cleaning lady would be watching the screen and seeing him. And if he walked into the arena looking like a beaten dog, they'd see confirmation of what they already knew. That the nobodies were pathetic. That they had no place among the gifted. Dan said nothing. She was right. Mandy began the training, not with punches, with walking. She made him walk around the yard, back and forth, stand up straight, shoulders back, head up, not like a servant, like a man who has something to prove. Dan walked. For 4,000 years, he had walked through the same day over and over. He was in the habit of slouching. He didn't notice. In the loop, there was no one to notice. Mandy noticed. She'd punch him in the back when he slumped. Not hard, but it stung. After an hour of walking, they moved on to working with an audience. Mandy placed 3 cans on the fence. She said they were the audience. She pointed to the one on the left. This one hates you. She pointed to the one in the middle. This one is indifferent. She pointed to the one on the right. This one wants you to win. You work for the one in the middle, always the one in the middle. You can't change the one on the left's mind. The one on the right is already yours. The middle one decides. Dan listened. This was new. In 4,000 years, he hadn't thought about the audience once. His fights were for a single spectator, for himself. Mandy made him move in front of the cans, punch the air, to dodge imaginary blows, and to do it beautifully. Not effectively, but beautifully, because the arena is a theater. The audience doesn't understand technique. They understand the story. A skinny guy against a gifted giant. David against Goliath. If you move like a master but look like a novice, they'll remember the novice. If you move like a novice but look like a hero, they'll remember the hero. Dan trained until noon. Then he went to open the coffee shop. Mandy went with him. It was her first time there during the day. She looked around the basement in the light. She said it was a bit small. Dan said he liked that it was small. Mandy snorted and sat down in the corner. She took up the whole bench, stretched out her legs, pulled out her phone. She stayed. Hale arrived on time. She saw Mandy. She raised her eyebrows. She asked who that was. Mandy said he was the coach. Hale asked, "Coach of what?" Mandy said he was the coach, making sure this guy didn't die at the tournament. Hale looked at Dan. Dan shrugged. Hale told Mandy she wanted to write about practice. Mandy said she could write, but if she lied even once, she'd personally smash her laptop. Hale said she'd been threatened with worse. Mandy laughed loudly. The whole basement could hear. She said she liked this little one. Hale said she wasn't short. Mandy said that everyone shorter than her was short. Hale was 5'2". Mandy was 5'9". There was no point in arguing. Dan stood behind the counter and listened to them bickering. A new sound. Two voices he couldn't have predicted. They spoke at the same time. They interrupted each other. They laughed. They got angry. They made up, all in 5 minutes. It was chaotic and beautiful. After 4,000 years of silence, Ji-woo arrived in the evening. She saw Mandy. Mandy saw Ji-woo. They knew each other, not personally, by reputation, the heiress of the Song House and the champion of the lower districts. Two worlds that never intersect, but they intersected in a flat, guy's basement coffee shop. Ji-woo sat in her corner, Mandy in hers, 3 meters between them and a whole social chasm. Dan made coffee for both of them, set it down silently. They drank in silence, glanced at each other surreptitiously. Dan could see them sizing each other up. Ji-woo saw in Mandy what she herself lacked: freedom, the chance to be loud and rude without fear of letting the house down. Mandy saw in Ji-woo what she'd never had: refinement, the confidence that comes with money and a name. Both were jealous. Both were hiding it. Dan didn't interfere. He just made coffee and waited. These two had to find common ground on their own, without his help, without his knowledge. Because if he told Mandy that Ji-woo was just as scared inside as she was, or told Ji-woo that Mandy longed to hear she was beautiful, that would be manipulation. He didn't manipulate. Never. He created the conditions. He brought people together. He gave them the right coffee and waited. They did the rest on their own. An hour later, Mandy couldn't stand the silence anymore. She asked Ji-woo point blank if she was going to really beat Dan at the tournament. Ji-woo replied that she was, that she had to, that Dom expected her to win and she couldn't fight at half strength. Mandy nodded. She said she respected that, and that if Ji-woo broke his nose, she'd set it for her herself afterward, for free. Ji-woo looked at her for 3 seconds. Then the corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Dan behind the counter saw it and realized that the coffee shop was working, not as a business, as a place. Here, people from different worlds sat side by side and began to see each other. Not status, not the gift, not a coat of arms, a person. Training continued every morning. Mandy pushed him hard, not on technique, on demeanor. How to stand. How to look. How to lose. Gracefully if he had to. How to win modestly if he got lucky. Dan was learning. For the first time in thousands of years, he was learning something from another person, not from books, not from observation. Directly. Teacher and student. It was unfamiliar and humiliating and wonderful all at once. He could disarm Mandy in a second, but he couldn't do what she did. Step into the ring and make the crowd stand up. She could do that, he couldn't. After a week of training, Mandy said he was ready. Not to win, just to not embarrass himself. Dan asked if that was a compliment. Mandy said that, from her, it was the best compliment he'd ever get. Then she looked at him strangely, looked away, asked if there was any coffee. Dan made some, strong, with pepper. As usual, he held out the cup. Their fingers touched. Mandy pulled her hand away. Quickly, too quickly, she said it was hot. Dan knew it wasn't hot. The temperature was 68, as always. Mandy left without finishing it for the first time. Dan stood behind the counter and thought about how Mandy Rice was 20 years old, that no one had ever told her she was beautiful, not as a fighter, not as a champion, as a girl. That her whole life she'd been like a boy among boys, and that the touch of his fingers on the cup shouldn't have made her pull her hand away, but it did. He remembered a story from the file. At the right moment, he'd tell her, calmly, without any hidden meaning, that she was beautiful, just like that. As he handed her the cup, and for the first time in her life, Mandy wouldn't know what to say. But not now. It was too soon. She wasn't ready to hear it yet, and he wasn't ready to say it yet, because every time he told the truth, people got scared, and he didn't want to scare them. He wanted to make coffee. There were 3 weeks left until the tournament. The world around Dan continued to remember. Cats came up to him. Doors opened more easily. Strangers said hello. Echo anomalies pulsed in small flashes. Kronos Lab was pulling sensors toward his neighborhood. The founding houses whispered about the flat going to the tournament. Evelyn came by every morning and said nothing. Hale wrote article after article. Ji-woo cooked her childhood recipe in the back room. Mandy sparred with a punching bag at 5 in the morning in the yard of her father's workshop. And Dan stood at the center of it all, quiet, calm, with a cup of coffee in his hands. A man who was 4,000 years old, who, for the first time in an eternity, was afraid of tomorrow. And for the first time in an eternity, he wanted it to come. There was 1 week left until the tournament. Dan stood behind the counter and wiped the cups. There were 9 of them now. Each had been brought by one of his own. Hale dragged in a mug with an inscription she had drawn herself with a marker. Mandy hauled in a metal thermos with a dent on the side. Ji-woo brought 2 more white ones from the house's supplies. Evelyn once silently placed a plain gray cup with no design on the counter. She didn't say a word, but the cup stayed. Dan wiped each one and thought that this was his wealth. Not money, not power, not 4,000 years of memory. 9 cups from people who decided this was their place, too. In the morning, Min-soo Park came. Dan wasn't expecting her. A short girl in a big hoodie, headphones around her neck, a backpack almost bigger than her. Her eyes were quick, nervous. She walked in and stopped at the door. She looked around the basement. She looked at Dan. She said she needed coffee and an outlet. Dan pointed to the outlet by the wall, the only one. Minsu sat down on the floor next to it. She took out her laptop, plugged it in, opened it. The screen lit up with code. Dan made her some coffee. He looked at her 2 seconds. 17 years old, pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, deeper than Evelyn's, fingers with minor burns from a soldering iron. She eats little, sleeps less, a worn-out pass bracelet on her wrist. Kronos Lab, a side division. She's from there. Dan knew Minsu by sight. Not closely. He'd seen her a few times. A little girl who, every single day, entered the Kronos Lab building through the side entrance at 8:55, with the same backpack, with the same headphones. He didn't know what she did inside. Never cared. He had other routes in his loop, but he remembered the bracelet. Now the bracelet was gone. Cut off. She'd left that place. Or run away. Dan set the coffee down next to her on the floor, not on the counter, on the floor, next to her, at her level. Minsko took the cup without looking, took a sip, stopped, looked at the coffee, looked at Dan. It wasn't coffee. It was hot chocolate, with marshmallows. She hadn't ordered hot chocolate. She said coffee, but Dan could tell. He could tell from her hands and her eyes and her posture that she didn't need coffee. She needed something warm and sweet and safe, something from her childhood, when the world wasn't yet codes and passes and server rooms. Minsu held the cup with both hands, small hands, slender hands. She sipped it in small sips. Then she said quietly that she hadn't had cocoa in a long time. Dan nodded. He didn't ask where she was from. Didn't ask why her bracelet was worn away. Didn't ask what the code on the screen was. He just stood behind the counter and wiped cups. Minsu worked for 3 hours. Then she closed her laptop. She looked at Dan, said she'd come back tomorrow, asked how much the hot chocolate was. Dan said the first one was free. Minsu nodded. She left. Hale, who had been sitting behind the counter the whole time, watched her go. She asked Dan who she was. Dan said he didn't know. Hale said he was lying. Dan said he wasn't lying. For the first time in a long time, he told the truth. He really didn't know Minsu. He only knew the bracelet and the eyes of a child who had grown up too soon. Minsu came the next day and the day after that. Every time she sat on the floor by the outlet, every time she got cocoa. On the third day, Dan set a small table next to the outlet, a low one made from a box he'd found at the dump and sanded down. Minsu looked at the table. She looked at Dan. She didn't say anything, but on the fourth day, she brought a small pillow and placed it on the floor next to the table. Her spot. She took it. On the fifth day, she spoke. Not about herself, about the tournament's security systems. She said she'd heard he was participating. She said the surveillance systems in the arena were full of holes, that the cameras were positioned crookedly, that the communication protocol between the judges and security was 3 years out of date. She said this between sips of cocoa, as if she were discussing the weather. Dan listened. He understood. She was offering help, in her own way, through code and systems, not with words. Minsu wasn't good with words. She was good with data. Dan asked why she wanted to do this. Minsu was silent. Then she said that Kronos Lab were bad people. That she'd seen what they were doing. That she'd left because she couldn't take it anymore. That if anyone was going up against them, she wanted to help. Her voice was steady. but her fingers on the cup were trembling. Dan nodded. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press her. He just made her some more hot cocoa with marshmallows and asked what kind of music she listened to when she was 11. Minsu froze. She looked at him. No one had ever asked her that. Never. They asked her about code, about algorithms, about systems, about hacking. No one asked what music she listened to when she was 11. She spoke softly. She named a band, an old one that no one listens to anymore. Childish, embarrassing. Dan nodded, said it was a good band. Minsu lowered her eyes. The corners of her lips twitched, almost a smile, almost. That evening, something happened that changed everything. Dan was closing up the coffee shop, washing the counter. The door opened. A woman stood in the doorway. Tall, dark hair down to her shoulders, a knitted cardigan, a book in her hand. A finger was tucked into a page. She looked at Dan. Calmly, without surprise, without interest, with something resembling recognition. Sora Lin, 24 years old, a former instructor at the Seven Towers Academy, the used bookstore across the street. Dan knew her better than anyone else. Back in the loop, she lived 3 houses down from him. Every single day, she walked past his window at 9:10 a.m. with a book in her hand, always a different one, always with a finger marking the middle. Over 4,000 years, he'd seen her 1.5 million times. And every time, he noticed something new. How she squinted in the sun, how she adjusts her glasses when they slip down, how she stopped by the streetlight for 3 seconds to finish a paragraph. She was the only constant in his day that never got boring. Because the book was the same one every time, but she read it as if for the first time, every day, with the same look of wonder on her face. Sora was special. Her gift was memory. She remembered by heart everything she had, and the gift had indirectly caught her in the loop. She didn't live in the loop like Dan, but something seeped through, fragments, shadows, the feeling that the day was repeating itself, even though it wasn't. She was the only one in town who suspected the truth. She didn't know. She suspected. Sora said she'd come in for coffee. Her voice was quiet, sarcastic, with a slight hoarseness. Dan said the coffee shop was closed. Sora looked at the sign on the door. She looked at him. She said the sign said open. Dan looked at the sign. He'd forgotten to flip it over. The first time in all these days he'd forgotten. Or maybe he hadn't. Sora walked in. She looked around, slowly, carefully, like someone reading the room like a book. She saw 9 cups. She saw a table by the outlet with a pillow. She saw a poster of Hale on the wall. She saw the gold scar on the cup. Kintsugi. She said it was beautiful work. Dan said, thank you. Sora sat down. She looked at him for a long time. Without awkwardness, without pressure, she just looked as if she were reading him. Then she said quietly that his eyes were older than his face. Dan froze. No one had ever said anything like that before. Everyone saw a 19-year-old guy. Strange, smart, incomprehensible, but a guy. Sora saw something else. She saw a depth that even he himself was hiding. He made her coffee. Black, no sugar, no additives, no tricks, just good coffee, perfect in temperature and extraction, nothing personal, nothing specific. Because Sora was the only one on whom he couldn't use his method, she would have noticed, she would have understood. Her gift allowed her to remember everything, and if he did something too precise, too personal, she would piece it together faster than Evelyn. Sora took a sip, nodded, said it was good coffee, ordinary, honest, as if he weren't trying to prove anything. Dan nodded. She understood even that, understood that he had deliberately chosen not to do anything special, and that in itself was special. Sora finished her coffee. She stood up. She said her shop was across the street, that he could stop by, that she had books he might want to read. Dan said he'd stop by. Sora left. She turned around at the door. She said the sign should be flipped over after all. Dan flipped it over, closed. He stood by the door and watched her cross the street. A knitted cardigan, a book in her hand, a finger on the page, just like 1.5 million times before. But now she turned around one more time, looked at the coffee shop windows, and Dan saw that very expression on her face. Quiet, almost imperceptible. She knew, not everything, but something. She sensed it on a level that defied logic, that this guy in the basement had lived longer more than anyone else in this city, and that he was so lonely that you could only see it if you knew where to look. Dan closed the door, sat down on the floor with his back to the counter, just like on the first day. But now there were cups all around, 9 of them, and a pillow by the outlet, and a poster on the wall, and the smell of coffee in the walls. His place, his people, the tournament in a week. In a week, everything could come crashing down. But right now, right this moment, he sat on the floor and felt how each of the 9 cups held a piece of someone's, and his coffee shop was full even when it was empty. 3 days until the tournament. Dan trained with Mandy in the morning, brewed coffee in the afternoon, thought at night. Minsu came every day and worked quietly by the outlet. She had hacked the tournament schedule. She didn't brag. She just showed Dan the screen. First round, 16 participants, one-on-one matches, draw. Next to each name was a note, house, rank, victories, statistics. Next to Dan's name was a single word, flat. Minsu showed him his first opponent, heir of House Wei, Stone Magic. 21 years old, 3 years at the academy, 2 regional tournaments won, a serious fighter. Dan knew him by heart. He'd seen him every day that day. The guy trained in the park, by the fountain, stone pillars rising from the ground, walls, spikes, powerful, beautiful, but predictable. Always left hand first, always weight on the right foot, always a pause after the third spell. Thousands of repetitions of the same fight. Dan knew his every move. Minsu asked if he was nervous. Dan said yes. He wasn't lying. He was nervous, not because of the fight, because of the cameras, because of the thousands of eyes, because of the chronograph sensors that would be in the arena, because one careless move, one prediction that was too accurate, and everything would be revealed. Minsu nodded. She said she'd done something. She'd tapped into the arena's sensor system. She hadn't shut it down. She hadn't hacked it. She'd just added noise, background interference, false positives. Now the sensors would be picking up anomalies all over the arena. Not just around Dan. The chronographs would spend days sifting through the real data to separate it from the junk. That would buy them time. Dan looked at her. Minsu was sitting on the floor, tiny, in a big hoodie, with cocoa in her hands. She had just outsmarted the security system of the city's largest corporation between sips of cocoa with marshmallows. He said, "Thank you." Minsu shrugged, said it wasn't hard. She said the hard part would be something else. She'd found something in the Kronos Lab archives when she worked there. She'd copied it before leaving. Project Anchor, files, documents, protocols. She hadn't read it all. She was afraid, but she read one thing. The loop had been triggered intentionally, not by accident. Someone at Kronos Lab had created it, directed it, at a specific person. Dan froze. He knew it. He felt it. But hearing confirmation was different. Minsu said the files specified the loop's target, a name, but the file is encrypted. She's working on decrypting it. It'll take time. Dan nodded. He said he wasn't in a hurry. He lied. Inside, everything tightened. A name. The name of the person the loop was intended for, whom he had accidentally replaced, who had lived a normal 4 years while Dan spun through a 1,000-year day. He knew it was Sora. He felt it, but he didn't know for sure yet, and he didn't want to know, because knowing would obligate him. It would demand action. It would demand a conversation, and he wasn't ready yet. Sora came in the evening, just like every evening of the last few days. She sat in the corner with a book. She drank coffee. Sometimes they talked about books, about the city, about the strange things happening with the weather lately. Superficial conversations, but beneath them lay something else. A quiet current. Two people who know there's something but are both afraid to say it out loud. Sora read. Dan wiped down the bar. Sometimes their eyes met, and they both quickly looked away, like teenagers. He was 4,000 years old. She was 24, and both were shy as children. Sora said she would go to the tournament. She would watch. Dan nodded. Sora said that for some reason she felt like he wouldn't lose. He wouldn't win, but he wouldn't lose. Dan asked why. Sora looked at him for a long time. Then she said that people with eyes like that don't lose. They just decide when to stop. Dan was silent. She saw him, truly, deeper than Evelyn with her analysis, deeper than Jiwoo with her intuition. Sora didn't see facts. She saw the essence. And it was beautiful and unbearable at the same time. She left, book in hand. Finger on the page. Dan stood by the window and watched her cross the street. He thought about the file on Minsu's laptop, about the encrypted name, about the fact that he would soon learn the truth, and about the fact that Sora deserved to be the first to know it. 2 days until the tournament. Evelyn arrived in the morning, not to her usual chair. She walked over to the counter. She stood in front of Dan, close. She said quietly that the chronographs were preparing an operation at the tournament. That management was certain the anchor would be among the participants or spectators. That sensors were placed throughout the arena. That the capture team was in position. Dan listened. He nodded. She continued. She said she'd reported to higher-ups that the anomalies near the coffee shop were background noise, residual, not tied to any specific person. That the checkup hadn't turned up anything. She'd lied. To her superiors. For his sake. Dan looked at her. Evelyn stood up straight. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. Her hands were at her sides. She had just put her career on the line. Her freedom. Her future. For the sake of a guy from the basement who'd made her jasmine tea. Dan said quietly that she shouldn't have. Evelyn said she knew. She said that Kim would have wanted her to do the right thing. Then she sat down in her chair, ordered black coffee, and they didn't speak again that day. The last day before the tournament. Dan closed the coffee shop at 5 in the evening, earlier than usual. He sat behind the counter, alone, quiet. The cat came in through the window he'd left, slightly open for her. She jumped onto his lap. She purred. Dan stroked her and thought tomorrow he would step into the arena, in front of thousands of people, in front of the cameras, in front of the houses and the chronographs and Kronos Lab, in front of Hale, who would be writing the report, in front of Jiwoo, who would be his rival, in front of Evelyn, who had lied for him, in front of Mandy, who had taught him to stand tall, in front of Minsu, who had hacked the system to protect him, in front of Sora, who would just be watching and knowing. He closed his eyes. 4,000 years. 1.5 million identical days. And it all led to this. To a small basement with 9 cups, to 6 women who, for various reasons, decided he was worth their time. To tomorrow, which he couldn't have predicted. He opened his eyes, he smiled, set the cat down on the floor, cleaned the counter, turned off the light, hung a sign on the door, open later tomorrow, tournament. He stepped outside, looked up at the sky, the stars, different every time. His stars. He walked home. The 7 Towers Arena, round, huge. 7 towers along the perimeter, each belongs to one of the founding houses. Between them are the stands, 12,000 seats, all filled. Screens on each tower broadcast the faces of the participants. Dan stood in the corridor under the stands. Dim light, concrete walls, the smell of sweat and nerves. Other participants nearby, 16 people, 15 gifted ones, 1 flat. They were looking at him, some with contempt, some with curiosity, some with pity. Dan wasn't looking at them. He was listening to the arena. The roar of the crowd, the commentator's voice, the music. He knew this arena. In the loop. It stood in the same place. He had been here, not as a contestant, as a spectator, hundreds of times. He knew every exit, every crack in the floor, every blind spot of the cameras. Mandy was standing behind the fence. She wasn't allowed any closer. Tournament rules, the coaches in the stands. She leaned over the fence and said 2 words to him. Back straight. Dan straightened up. Haley was in the press area. Press pass. She'd snagged it through the student portal. The first flat at the tournament is news. She sat with her laptop and trembling hands. Evelyn stood in the chronographs section. Uniform jacket, stone-faced. She wasn't looking at Dan. She was looking at the screens, at the sensors, at her colleagues' devices. Monitoring. Not him. Those who were monitoring him. Minsu was sitting somewhere in the crowd. Headphones, laptop on her lap, connected to the system. Monitoring her interference, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Ji-woo was among the participants. 3 people away from Dan, in a white songhouse uniform, hair pulled back, face calm. She didn't look at him, not once. She kept her distance. Right, on camera, any glance would be interpreted. Sora was in the stands, top row, a book in her hand, but she wasn't reading. She was looking down at the arena, at a small figure in the aisle. Dan didn't see her, but he knew she was there. He could feel it. The first fight. Dan versus the heir of House Wei, Stone Magic. 21 years old. The guy entered the arena first. Tall, broad, confident. The stands roared with approval. They recognized their own. Dan entered second. Silence. Then laughter. Then whispers. Flat. Formless. In the plain training clothes Mandy had made him buy. Black. Simple. No crests or insignia. The commentator called his name, Daniel Hale. Status, no gift, invited under the social inclusion program. There was polite sympathy in the commentator's voice. Dan stood in the center of the arena. He looked at his opponent. 2 seconds. All it took. The heir to House Wei struck first. A stone pillar rose from the arena floor. Quickly, powerful, right where Dan had been standing. But Dan wasn't standing there anymore. He'd shifted half a second before the strike. He didn't dodge. He just stepped aside, like a man stepping around a puddle on the sidewalk. Naturally, effortlessly. A second pillar, a third, a wall. Spikes rising from the floor. The arena trembled with stone magic. The spectators gasped. The commentator shouted, and Dan walked. He simply walked across the arena, between the pillars, between the walls, between the spikes. Every step precise, every movement economical. He didn't run, he didn't jump, didn't somersault. He walked. The heir of House Wei stopped. He was breathing heavily. 10 spells in a row, a serious strain, and the flat guy across from him hadn't even broken a sweat. He stood and watched, calmly. The stands fell silent. The commentator fell silent mid-sentence. Something had changed. The air felt different. People began to realize that what was happening wasn't what they'd expected. Not a beating of the flat-chested guy, something else. The air of the Way House struck again. With all his might, a shockwave rippled across the arena floor. Fast, wide, nowhere to hide. Dan stepped forward, into the wave, placed his foot on the crest, pushed off, flew over the wave. He landed behind his opponent. Softly, silently. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy flinched, turned around. Dan was standing 20 centimeters away, looking him in the eyes, calmly. And he spoke quietly so that only he could hear. He said he knew about the letter the heir to Houseway had written to his mother 3 years ago and never sent, about how he didn't want to be the heir. Didn't want stone magic, wanted to paint, that the letter was in the bottom drawer of his desk under his textbooks. The guy turned pale. His eyes were glassy. He stood there staring at Dan, unable to move, not out of fear, out of shock, out of the fact that someone had spoken aloud what he had been hiding for 3 years. Dan withdrew his hand. He stepped back. He said the fight was over. The referee didn't get it. The crowd didn't get it. But the heir to Houseway did. He dropped his hands, turned to the referee, said he was giving up. The arena erupted. Shouts, whistles, confusion. Flat had defeated the heir of the house without landing a single blow. No magic, no fists. Dan returned to the hallway. His hands were shaking. He leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes. What had he done? He had used the knowledge from the loop to break a man. He hadn't struck him. Worse, he had understood. He understood in front of thousands of people. He understood so completely that the guy couldn't go on. It was brutal, and it was his only strength. Mandy found him in the hallway. She said, "That was it." Dan didn't answer. Mandy looked at his face. She fell silent. She realized he wasn't celebrating. She sat down next to him. Silently, she didn't touch him. She just sat there. Round 2, round 3, round 4. Dan went through each one the same way. No magic, no punches. He dodged everything that came at him. He moved around the arena with impossible precision. And at the end of every fight, he walked up to his opponent and said one phrase, quietly. Just for him, one truth that the opponent was hiding, and every time the opponent surrendered, not from pain, from understanding. By the 4th fight, the arena had stopped booing. It had gone quiet. People stared at the screens, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. A flat without the gift was destroying the gifted without even touching them. Hale in the press box was typing so fast that the keys clattered like rain. Evelyn in the chronograph section saw the sensors fall silent. Minsu's jammers were working, but Evelyn knew that jammers weren't forever. That every battle brings closer the moment when someone will understand. Jiwoo had fought her battles. Clean, fast. The crystalline magic of the songhouse. Flawless technique. Cold beauty. She didn't look at Dan between battles. But he saw her clenching her fists behind her back. The semifinals, Dan against the prodigy from the House of Cain. Fire magic. Fast, hot, dangerous. This fighter was different. Not an heir playing in the tournament. A veteran, 28 years old. Scars on his arms. Hard eyes. He stepped into the arena and told Dan he didn't know what tricks he was pulling, but they wouldn't work on him. He had no secrets. He'd burned it all away long ago. Dan looked at him. 2 seconds, and realized the veteran wasn't lying. This man was truly empty, scorched from the inside. A fighter with no past, no shame, No hidden letters or unspoken words, pure function. Words won't help. For the first time in the entire tournament, Dan would have to fight for real, with his body, without magic, without words. The fire mage struck. Dan moved, not like before, faster, harsher. Mandy in the stands leaned forward. She saw it. She saw how he stopped walking and started fighting. His movements were pure, perfect, millennia in every step. He dodged the fire, passed through the heat, closed the distance, struck, softly, precisely, at the nerve centers. At the points he knew because he had studied anatomy thousands of times. The fire mage didn't fall. He held his ground, struck back. The arena was on fire. The crowd was screaming. Dan took a hit, a fiery fist to the ribs. Pain, real, sharp. He flew back 3 meters, fell, got up. His ribs were cracking, but he stood. Mandy in the stands clung to the railing. Hale stopped typing. Jiwoo in the hallway turned pale. Dan stood, blood on his lip. His ribs were burning. But he stood, and he smiled. Because for the first time in thousands of years, he was in real pain. Not the kind of pain that would fade by morning. Real pain. The kind that would stay. The kind he had earned. He stepped forward. The fire mage struck again. Dan took the blow with his shoulder. He walked through the flames. He stood right up close and struck once with an open palm to the solar plexus. He put everything into it, not magic. His body, 4,000 years of muscle memory in a single movement. The veteran doubled over, fell to his knees, didn't get up, silence. Then a roar, 12,000 people, flat in the final of the Seven Towers tournament. Dan stood over his fallen opponent, ribs broken. Hand burned, lip split. The commentator was shouting something about the impossible. Dan didn't hear. He looked at the stands. He searched. He found her, Sora, top row, book closed. She was looking at him, not smiling, not shouting, just looking. And Dan saw confirmation on her face. She knew. Now she knew for sure. People with eyes like that don't lose. They just decide when to stop. The Seven Towers Tournament Final. Daniel Hale versus Jiwoo Song. The flat-chested guy from the basement versus the heiress of the founding house. The arena was buzzing. 12,000 people. Screens all over Arcadia. The commentators were choking on their words. The event of the year. Dan sat in the hallway beneath the stands. His ribs were bandaged. His hand was burned. The pain was dull, constant. Mandy had bandaged him herself, roughly, tightly, securely. She said that if his ribs punctured his lung, she'd finish him off herself. Dan nodded. Hale ran over from the press area. Her eyes were burning. Her cheeks were red. She said her article was already racking up views, that screens all over the city were showing the broadcast. That couriers were stopping their scooters in front of the screens. That cleaning ladies in the towers were turning on their phones. That this was more than just the tournament. She said he had to win. Dan looked at her. He didn't say he wasn't going to beat Jiwoo. He didn't say he'd promised her he wouldn't humiliate him. He didn't say that the final was a conversation for him, not a fight. He just nodded. Hale ran back. Evelyn appeared for a minute, quickly, between shifts. She said the chronograph leadership had requested a recheck of the sensors. They'd noticed Minsu's interference. They didn't realize it was interference, but they noticed the noise. They started cleaning the data. They might have an hour. After that, the data will be clean. And if Dan creates an anomaly in the arena, everyone will see it. Dan nodded. An hour. The final battle lasts a maximum of 20 minutes. That should be enough. Evelyn stood in front of him. She looked at him. Then she said quietly. She said that if things went wrong, she would get him out, somehow. Even if it's the last thing she does in uniform. Dan wanted to say she shouldn't. But he looked into her eyes and saw that arguing was pointless. She'd made up her mind, just like she had back then with the false report. Quietly, firmly, without hesitation, she left. Dan stood up. He walked toward the arena entrance. Ji-woo was standing in the hallway. In a white songhouse uniform, her hair pulled back, her face calm, beautiful, cold. They stood facing each other, 2 meters between them. She said she wouldn't hold back. Dan said he knew. She said that if he used his word tricks on her, she wouldn't forgive him. Dan said he wouldn't. She looked at him. Something flashed in her eyes, quick, warm. She hid it instantly, turned away, stepped into the arena. The crowd greeted her with an ovation. House. Song. The heiress. The favorite. Dan followed her out. The crowd split. One half whistled, the other half shouted his name. The flat ones. The ones who had never been here before, who had never shouted from the stands, who had always looked up from below. Now they were shouting, and for the first time, Dan felt something from their cries. Not pride, not vanity, responsibility. These people believed in him. Couriers and janitors and delivery people. The flat ones. Just like him on paper, they looked at him and saw themselves, and he had no right to let them down. The referee gave the signal. Ji-woo struck first. Crystal magic, beautiful, icy spears from the air, sharp, fast, deadly. Dan dodged, a step to the left, a step to the right. The spears flew past. He knew her every move. He'd seen her train 1,000 times, but she was different, faster than in the loop. More vicious, more precise. The 4 years of growth he'd missed. The 4 years in which he'd grown stronger. The new Ji-woo, whom he didn't fully know, and that made the fight real. She attacked. Wave after wave. Crystals, ice, sharp edges. The arena was covered in frost. Dan moved between attacks. He didn't strike back. He dodged. He waited. The spectators didn't understand. The commentator said that Flat was stalling, that he was tired after the semifinals, that he would fall now. Dan wasn't stalling. He was listening to her fight like music. Every crystal was a note. Every attack was a phrase. He heard in this fight what Ji-woo didn't say with words. Anger at her father, fear of not measuring up, the desire to prove herself, the desire to be noticed. Not as an heiress, as herself. She poured everything she couldn't say into every strike, and Dan listened because that was the only thing he truly knew how to do. Listen. Ji-woo stopped. She was breathing heavily. The entire arena was covered in crystals. Dan stood in the center. Not a single scratch. She looked at him. There were tears in her eyes. Not from pain, from helplessness. She had given everything, and he hadn't even struck back. Dan took a step toward her. Another, a third. He walked slowly. Through the crystals, through the shards of ice. Ji-woo raised her hand, the last crystal. Large, sharp, aimed at his chest. He stopped, reached out, touched the crystal. It froze in midair. Not magic. He simply touched it. And Ji-woo couldn't attack, not physically, emotionally. She couldn't drive the crystal into a man who was walking toward her with open arms. The crystal crumbled. Ji-woo lowered her hands. Dan stood before her, close. He spoke softly, so only she could hear. He said she wasn't a display case, that her coffee with cinnamon and orange zest and a drop of miso was the most beautiful drink he'd ever tasted, that her father was lonely and didn't know how to say it. That she was free, right now, In this arena, in front of everyone, free to be herself, Ji-woo stood there, tears streaming down her cheeks, silent. Then she did something no one expected. She raised her hand and created a crystal, small, transparent, cup-shaped. She placed it in Dan's palm, turned to the judge, and said she was giving up. The hall fell silent, then erupted, but Dan didn't hear the explosion because at that moment, another man entered the arena, not through the contestants' entrance, through the central box. A man, tall, thin, a gentle smile, an expensive suit, Dr. Alistair Vane, head of the research department at Kronos Lab. He walked across the arena calmly, as if through his own office. The tournament security parted. No one stopped him. Vane picked up the microphone. His voice was soft, warm, charming. He said he apologized for the intrusion, that he had an important announcement for all of Arcadia. The hall fell silent. The cameras turned. Vane looked at Dan, smiled, and began to speak. He said that this young man was not who he claims to be, that he isn't flat, that he is the anchor, a man within whom a time loop thousands of years long has collapsed. That he isn't one of them. He is a monster in human skin. That Kronos Lab is ready to take him away safely, peacefully, for his own good and for the good of all the residents of Arcadia. The hall was silent. 12,000 people, screens all over the city, silence. Dan stood in the arena, a crystal cup in his hand, blood on his lip, broken ribs, Wayne across from him, smiling, waiting, everything according to plan. His plan, cameras, spectators, public exposure. Dan had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. 4,000 years had led to this moment. Dan stood in the arena. 12,000 eyes, cameras, screens all over Arcadia. Wayne stood opposite him, smiling, waiting for a response, waiting for panic, waiting for flight, or rage, or pleading. He knows all the reactions. He himself is a former anchor. He himself went through the loop 10 years ago, came out a different person, cold, empty, functional. He knows how it breaks a person, and he waits to see a crack in Dan. Dan looked at the crystal cup in his hand, small, transparent. Ji-woo made it from the last crystal, the very one she'd wanted to hit him with. He put the cup in his pocket, carefully, like the most precious thing in the world. Then he raised the microphone. The hall fell silent. The city fell silent. Dan spoke, calmly, without a tremor, without grandstanding. He said yes. He said it was all true, that he had lived 4,112 years in a single day. That he knew about everyone in this hall, things they themselves had forgotten about themselves. His voice was steady, quiet, but the microphone carried it throughout the arena, across all the screens, throughout all of Arcadia. He said he knew that the chairwoman was hiding a letter from her daughter in the bottom drawer of her desk, that the captain of the chronographs cried in his car after his shift, that the flower seller on the corner of 3rd Street sniffs white lilies every day and thinks of her husband who left 7 years ago, that the boy in the 3rd row of the left section has a note in his pocket for the girl next to him and is afraid to give it to her. Absolute silence. The people in the stands froze. Someone covered their mouth with their hand. Someone turned pale. The boy in the 3rd row blushed and hid his hand in his pocket. Dan continued. He said he knew everything. And that over 4,000 years he'd come to understand one thing. He paused. Wayne stood across from him. His smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected calm. He hadn't expected openness. He'd expected defensiveness, denial, fear, but he got honesty, and he didn't know what to do with it. Dan said that the only thing worth breaking free from the loop for was the chance to make coffee for someone you haven't had a chance to get to know yet. Silence. Then he looked at Wayne, straight on, calmly, said he wouldn't go with him, that he had a shift at 7 in the morning. He lowered the microphone. He turned and walked toward the exit. Wayne stood there. The smile was gone. His face had changed. It was hard, empty. The face of a man who hadn't just been rejected, who had been understood, and for whom it was unbearable. He called out to Dan's back, said he was making a mistake, that they were the same, that only the two of them in the whole city knew what it was like. Thousands of years in a single day, thousands of years of loneliness, that these people around him would never understand him, that they were mayflies, moths. That in 50 years they would die, and he would be left with the memory of them, and that would hurt more than any noose. Dan stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood with his back to Wayne, his back to 12,000, his back to the cameras. Wayne continued. His voice was quieter, almost intimate. He said he knew Dan was afraid of getting attached, that he remembered each of them through thousands of nooses while they were seeing him for the first time, that this asymmetry wouldn't go away, that he would always know more about them than they knew about him, that this wasn't love, it was observation, that he didn't live with them, he studied them like butterflies under glass. Dan stood there. Wayne's words hit the mark. Because Wayne knew. Because Wayne was the same. Because Wayne was right. Partly. In that dark part, Dan hid from himself. Yes, he knew more about them than he should. Yes, he remembered them by their loops, but they didn't remember him. Yes. The asymmetry existed. And yes. Sometimes at 3 in the morning, he lay there and thought that Wayne was right, that he didn't love them, he just collects them. Then he turned, looked at Wayne, said one sentence. Said that the difference between them was that Wayne had stepped out of the loop and decided that people weren't worth the pain, and he had stepped out of the loop and decided they were. Wayne fell silent. Something broke on his face, a micro crack in the perfect facade. Dan saw it. Over 4,000 years, he had learned to see cracks, and in that crack, he didn't see a monster, not a villain, not the main antagonist. He saw a man whom the loop had broken, who had stepped out and found no one with a cup of tea, whom no one was waiting for whom no one had made coffee, who had become empty not because he wanted to, but because he knew no other way. Dan spoke to him quietly, so quietly that the microphone barely picked it up. He said, There was a free chair. Wayne stood there, 10 seconds, 20, his face stony. Then he turned and walked away. Through the center box, silently, quickly, security behind him. Dan stood alone in the arena. 12,000 people were silent. Then someone started clapping. One person. In the top row, Sora Lynn. She stood and clapped, slowly, steadily, book closed, on her knees. Then Mandy, somewhere to the left, quietly, with a roar. With a scream. Then Hale, in the press area, with teary eyes. Then Minsu, quietly, with her palms. Then flat, all over the hall, all over the city. Couriers, cleaners, salespeople, delivery people. Those who were never heard. Those who never clapped in the stands. Those who always looked up from below. They clapped. The hall roared. Dan stood and listened. His ribs ached. His hand was burned. His lip was split. His eyes were wet. He stood and listened as 12,000 people clapped for him. Not a hero. Not a champion. A guy from the basement who makes coffee. He walked down from the arena. All 6 of them were waiting for him at the exit of the corridor. Ji Woo was standing first, Her face was wet with tears, but her back was straight. She wasn't crying out of weakness. She was crying because she had lost for the first time and didn't feel like a loser. Hale stood next to her. She was biting her lip, a laptop under her arm. Her eyes were red. She wanted to say something, but couldn't. For the first time in her life, the journalist was at a loss for words. Evelyn stood slightly to the side. Her uniform jacket was unbuttoned. Her hands were at her sides. She looked at Dan and smiled for the first time ever. Not a shadow of a smile, not almost. For real. Mandy stood leaning against the wall. Her arms were crossed. Her eyes were wet, but her face was cheerful. She said her back was straight. Minsu was sitting on the floor, laptop on her lap, headphones around her neck. She raised her hand and gave a thumbs up. Silently, Sora was the last to stand, a book in her hand, a finger on the page. She walked over to Dan. Silently, she handed him a thermos. Dan took it, opened it. It smelled like coffee. Black. No sugar. Simple. Honest. She'd brewed it herself, for him. Dan took a sip. Hot. Bitter. A little off in the extraction. Not perfect. The best coffee of his life. He looked at Sora. She looked at him. They both knew. Then she said quietly that they needed to talk, when he was ready, about the loop, about who it was meant for. Dan nodded, said he knew, that he would tell her everything. Sora nodded. She wasn't surprised. She had long suspected she was the target, her gift of memory, the perfect target. She had lived 4 ordinary years. He had lived 4,000 for her, and she accepted it, quietly, calmly. The way you accept a truth you've known for a long time but didn't want to say out loud. They left the arena, all 7 of them, into the night. The city glowed. The screens were still showing a replay of the final. Dan's face on every wall. They walked down the street in silence, Mandy in front. Loudly, Hale beside her, typing something into her phone. Jiwoo and Evelyn side by side. They weren't talking, but they kept pace. Minsu behind them, wearing headphones, but the music was off. She was just listening to their footsteps. Sora next to Dan, silent. The book was closed. For the first time in a long time, not in the middle of a page, she'd finished it or started a new one. They reached the coffee shop. Dan opened the door, turned on the light. The lamp hummed. The coffee machine clicked in greeting. 9 cups on the shelf, a pillow by the outlet, a poster on the wall. The bench was from Mandy. The cups were from Jiwoo, Evelyn's gray mug. He stood behind the counter, took off his jacket, put on an apron. His hands rested on the machine as usual. He looked at them, at the 6 of them. Each had taken their place. Hale on the 3rd chair from the left. Jiwoo in the corner. Evelyn by the window, Minsu on the floor by the outlet, Mandy on the bench, Sora in the far corner with a book. Dan started brewing coffee, 6 cups each for a specific person. A lavender latte for Hale, a nutty one with dark chocolate for Jiwoo, strong black coffee for Evelyn, hot cocoa with marshmallows for Minsu, strong coffee with pepper and ginger for Mandy, black coffee without sugar for Sora. He set the cups down one by one, silently, each in its place, in front of its owner. Then he made one for himself, sat down on a stool behind the counter, took a sip. It's bitter, it's sour, cheap beans, perfect. Hale was the first to break the silence. She said he was an idiot, that he shouldn't have said that on camera. That now the whole town knows, that Kronos Lab won't back down, that the houses won't back down, that his life has changed forever. Dan said he knew. Mandy said that if anyone tried anything, she'd personally break every bone in their body. Evelyn said quietly that the chronographs would receive their orders by morning, that they had the night. Minsu said she was already working. that she was rerouting data, that she was laying false trails, that she could buy them 3 days. Jiwoo said that Damsong wouldn't let them take him, that she would talk to her father, that after that coffee at the right temperature, her father would listen to her. Sora said nothing. She just opened a book, found a page, read one sentence aloud, an old one, from a book no one remembers, about how a home isn't walls, but the people who return. Dan listened to them, all of them, every voice, every plan, every promise. 6 women who, for various reasons, had decided that this basement was their place, that this guy was their guy, that this story was their story too. He couldn't lie to them, couldn't hide it, couldn't pretend to be ordinary. They knew, they all knew, and they stayed. Not in spite of the truth. The truth. Because each of them knew what it meant to be seen, and each wanted to see him in return. Dan finished his coffee, set down the cup, looked at them, said that tomorrow morning the cafe would open as usual at 7. No matter what happened, the cafe is open. Day 1. Every day is the first. Hale snorted. Mandy slapped the table. Evelyn nodded. Minsu gave a thumbs up. Jiwoo smiled slightly. For the first time. For real. Sora closed the book. Night. A small basement. The light of a lamp. 9 cups, 6 women, 1 man who is 4,000 years old, who, for the first time in an eternity, wasn't afraid of tomorrow, because tomorrow he'll wake up, go down to his basement, turn on the machine, load the beans, open the door, and the threshold will stand people he knows and people he doesn't know yet, and for each of them, he'll brew coffee. Not perfect, not technical, just right for the specific person across from him. Because as long as there's a specific you, he's not an archive. He's Dan, just Dan, who brews coffee. And on the door of the coffee shop hung a sign, a new one. Hale wrote it by hand, crooked, with a smudge. Open, for the first time today.